here today to join the Youth for Climate live series.
Answering the question, what would you do if you were your country's Minister of the Environment?
What would I do to fight the climate change?
What would you do?
If I was the Minister for Environment in India.
In my country, Kenya.
Republic of Moldova.
I think the first thing I would do is put all the other ministers in the same room.
The Finance Minister, Energy Minister, Agricultural Minister.
To ensure that a climate mitigation and adaptation strategy is mainstreamed and implemented across all sectors.
First thing I would do would be to implement a Green New Deal.
I would focus on introducing binding national guidelines for green accounting in government procurement.
I would push for decreasing greenhouse gas emissions 10% every year for the next 10 years.
Tendría como prioridad la reforestación de todas las capitales provinciales de mi país.
I would create a concrete plan to protect our oceans.
Then I would protect our forests and grow more trees.
To combat environmental degradation and climate change.
Second, focus on energy efficiency of housing centers.
I would work towards a distributed renewable energy system.
I would only have electric cars and encourage battery brands to make rechargeable batteries for planes, cars and bikes.
And third, I would encourage the role of marginalized communities in climate change because I think these have unlocked potential.
The participation of indigenous people and local communities will be enforced in the planning and implementation of forest conservation.
I'll make sure that young people are actively and adequately involved in environmental decision-making processes.
Open up spaces for the sharing of multiple stories.
I would hold weekly televised press briefings on the latest climate reports and ecological surveys.
I would ensure that a climate curriculum is mainstreamed at all levels of learning.
Action is driven by awareness, and awareness is built with education. And we need everyone to act. Hence, we need everyone to know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome back to the third installment of the Youth for Climate live series. We're so happy that you can join us today. We want to make sure that the session is as interactive as possible, so please do turn on your camera so we can see you on the video wall. And if you're here for the first time, welcome. You can learn more about the series by going to our website, youthforclimate.live. I'm your co-host, Ahmed Badr.
And I am your other co-host, Salina Abraha. And looking at the poll results, we seem to have people joining from Italy, Afghanistan, Belize, Nigeria, California, Egypt. It's so great to see that people are tuning in from all over the world. And we want to invite you to please continue sharing your thoughts with us throughout this episode, both in the chat and on social media with the hashtag #YouthForClimateLive. And just a little housekeeping, this whole session is being translated into Italian. So all of you joining from Italy, if you want to listen in Italian, just change the language below. If you joined our last episode, you'll remember we talked about a sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And for those of you who didn't attend, you can check out the overview in the Lowdown blog. The link will be sent in the chat shortly, but you can also watch the whole episode on our website, youthforclimate.live. So, as you guys might know, this month we celebrated International Youth Day. And we want to keep the celebration going by looking at how young people are taking action on climate.
Absolutely. And today's discussion will focus on two key areas. First, how young people are the driving forces in advancing climate solutions. And second, how young people and governments can collaborate in generating meaningful youth participation in climate policy. And we'll really focus on that word meaningful and what it represents to each of our speakers, but also to you, our audience.
To kick off this segment, we would like to invite the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, Jayathma Wickramanayake.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Salina. Hello, Ahmed. How are you?
Hey,
Hi.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining.
So good to see you.
Thank you for having me. So I I'm so excited to see so many young people joining from around the world, after being in the audience of the previous Youth for Climate episodes and watching you guys in action. I'm finally so excited to be here and joining the action in person. So to those who don't know me, my name is Jayathma Wickramanayake. I'm the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. I work as an advisor and a representative of the UN Secretary General when it comes to matters affecting young people. And of course, climate action is on the very top of my agenda. And I've been so privileged to work with so many amazing young people over the years to make sure their voices, their demands, and their concerns are heard at the highest level at the United Nations through different summits, meetings, conferences, and most recently through the Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change that the Secretary General recently launched, and you will hear more about our very own members in the coming hour. So yes, I'm very excited to be here, especially on a very important month celebrating young people, the International Youth Month, as I call it, 31 days of celebrating young people's activism, this year's theme being Youth for Global Action. So again, I don't want to talk too much. I'm really looking forward to listen to both of you and our amazing speakers, and perhaps come in at the end and add something if I have to.
Exactly. Thank you so much. We do look forward to hearing more from you later in the program. And coming back, I just want to talk about how there's so many different ways that we as young people can take action on climate. We can be innovators or entrepreneurs. We can organize projects in our communities, or we can engage directly with decision makers to influence climate policy. And this last one, working with and influencing decision making, is what we want to focus on today. And we also want to hear your experiences with this. So tell us what you have been doing in your home countries.
And your input here will help guide the upcoming conversation. So we'd like you to either scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the chat to go to a very special poll. And the first question we want to ask you is, do you engage with decision makers in your country to shape climate policy? We have a few options. Yes, all the time, sometimes, or no, but I'd like to. And we can watch the results come in live.
All right, now we're seeing it.
Here we go. Seems like most folks are in between the sometimes and the no, but I'd like to. So I think that places the conversation in a really interesting place as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's one of those things that we would love to do, and but it's not so easy, and that's really what this episode wants to dive into today. So we will continue using Menti. So those of you who've not already gone on, go to menti.com and use the code or join through the link in the chat. The next question that we want to ask is one that really applies to everyone, whether you have engaged or you haven't. We want to know, when you haven't engaged with decision makers, what has been the barrier or challenge that stops you? And for those of you who said, yes, I'm engaging with decision makers all the time, we want you to think back to when you haven't, and what was that big barrier or challenge that you had to get past? We've got a few different responses. The first, I don't know who to contact. Second, I feel powerless or that it won't make a difference. I don't have enough confidence, or I don't have enough knowledge yet. The fourth is, I don't think that they care. And the last one is other. So please tell us in the chat if there's something that isn't captured in this poll.
And we understand that this is a discussion that's very complicated, and we don't want to limit this to just these options. And so if you have more to say, please do send over your thoughts in the chat.
This is a really, I love reading these responses, because I feel the same way when I think about engaging with decision makers for my country. The first one is like, what decisions, so many options, who do we contact? So I see that a lot of people are really rallying around that one. But also,
yeah, that one seems to be the kind of the main one, or the one that's kind of dominating at the moment. And it'll be interesting to hear from our speakers about kind of their experience with just access, and a lot of this is kind of logistics. It's like, who do I talk to, and when, and how?
Yeah, And then also for those of you who said, I don't have enough confidence or knowledge yet, we think that our speakers will have a lot to say about these results. So I think this is a great time for us to bring them on. Today, we are very excited to welcome to the stage Ernest Gibson from Fiji, Heeta Lakhani from India, and Rachele Rizzo from Italy. Perfect.
Hi, thank you for joining us. We'd also like to welcome Jayathma back so she can be part of what I know is going to be a very insightful conversation. And before we dive in, we want to quickly introduce our amazing speakers. Ernest is a member of the Secretary General's newly launched Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, the same one that Jayathma mentioned. Heeta is a climate educator and the Global South focal point for Youngo, the official youth constituency of the UNFCC. Rachele is the youth section coordinator and the contact point to the UNFCC of the Italian Climate Network. Thanks for joining us.
Perfect. And we want to kick it off with Ernest. We'd love to start with you. First and foremost, we want to say a huge congratulations to your new appointment as a member of the Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Now, we want to hear a little bit more. The Youth Advisory Group recently had a conversation with the Secretary General about his climate strategy and his vision for raising ambition. How do you think that this new group will be able to help bring these aspirations to life? And also, what are your hopes for this new group and what you might be able to accomplish in the next year?
Thank you. Maya Maori, Misan Bolivnaka, and warm Pacific greetings to everybody joining us on this call from whatever corner of the world you're in. It just so happens it's about 2 a.m. in my corner of the world, and I really do hope that I can communicate with some level of clarity. And I would like to extend a big vinaka vakalevu to the organizing committee for inviting me to be on this call. I think it's fantastic when you can navigate and accommodate for somebody who is several time zones away from you, and I really do appreciate the patience that you've had with accommodating my participation. To go straight into answering the questions that you had, I'll start with the first one around how I think the Youth Advisory Group will be useful. And I would like to touch on the way in which youth engagement in general is extremely useful to conversations, but also the way in which when you have youth involved in a conversation, deliberately and meaningfully, the conversation changes entirely, recognizing that there is a level of a different experience in which across intergenerations we have. And when we provide the nexus for these to be able to merge, we ensure that the conversation is open, but also agile. And agile is a word that I would like to come to later in my intervention. And when I think about youth engagement, I think specifically around the ability and the agency and the capacity that youth have to be able to mobilize and organize in a way that is extremely effective and efficient. And a really clear example that I can bring to you from our region is the way in which, in the Pacific, one of the biggest things that we face are tropical cyclones. And to give context to those of us who are less familiar, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had upwards of 8 category 4 or 5 tropical cyclones affect multi-country clusters. And the one thing that has enabled our ability to bounce back from these has been the way in which youth networks have been able to activate in these times. And I think that's the first kind of value add that the Youth Advisory Group has, right? That we have the ability to be able to adapt and change and reshape in a way that I'm going to be a little bit biased here, in a way that no other generation has the ability to do at this point. And the second one is when we think about youth futures, when we think about the ways in which this particular cohort of youth have a very interesting and amazing opportunity at this point, and it's to not just design the future that we want, but to co-design it with the generation before us and the generation that is going to come after us, as well as our fellow colleagues within our own generation. And that level of co-design to ensure that we have a future that we want to live in, but also that we are proud to allow our children to inherit is probably the biggest driving force that youth have to ensure that we're doing the right thing now. But then I think specifically about the group, and what I find so enormously inspirational about those in this group, and I'm closing my eyes for emphasis, is that we have an enormously diverse group with people who are lawyers, who have an economics background, who have a communications background, who have a background in hardcore activism. And again, that ensures that the conversation is multifaceted and multidimensional, but also ensuring that we have the ability to drive and create and instigate change in a way that, again, coming back to that word, is agile and absolutely necessary. So we're not just creating the future that we want, but we're creating the future that we need. And when I think about my aspirations for this particular group, I think about two key things. Recognizing that as a body, we are fairly new to a space that has been inhabited by people who have been working in this movement for a long time, and we need to be able to pay respect to work that is already in existence. And so as a group, we need to find ways in which we're adding value and not duplicating work. We need to find ways in which we're continually streamlining our own processes, but also uplifting and ensuring that we're carrying forward work that has already been in place for a long time. And so that's the first thing, is ensuring we're adding value. And on every single call that we've had just within ourselves and with the Youth Envoy's office, we talk about this way in which we can add value and what's our why and how are we going to share that going forward. And then the second one, and this is just because my background is in community engagement and communications, is around ensuring that every conversation that we had is backed up in an evidence-based way through community consultation. We can no longer rely on the top-down approach. That has failed us over and over again. The only thing that's failed us more than that is the capitalist economy. And so we need to ensure that we're learning from our communities, but also if we're going to represent our own regions, we need to ensure that we're resourcing and financing ways in which we can communicate with the people on the ground. I've spent the last week in informal settlements traveling across Fiji, and honestly, that was probably the most rewarding thing I've done in the last 23 years. Talking to people who have been the most hardly affected by COVID-19 within our region, understanding the problems that they face. And what I found really inspirational is that they are in probably some of the hardest situations ever. But every time we went into a house to ask them about a UN 75 dialogue, their response was, please come join us, have a cup of tea, we're cooking dinner, would you like to sit with us? And these are people who are struggling to ensure that they have their daily needs met. But their worry was ensuring that the people who were coming to bring change was that the needs of us were being met. And so for me, that's my driving force at the moment, is ensuring that these people are the people that we constantly need to take advice from and hear from, and they're the ones that we need to create a different world for. I think I've taken up a significant amount of your time, and I hope that was useful. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much. I think for all of us attending this and for all of us who have been carrying the torch for several years on youth engagement, we're so happy to hear you sharing these priorities, sharing what you hope this group can do, how you'll add value. And yeah, just want to share that we're all 100% behind you in supporting this initiative. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Heeta, would like to move on to you. During the first episode, we had a chance to hear from Marie-Claire, who was Youngo's Global North focal point, about how young people are engaged in climate negotiations. And for those who missed that episode, you can catch up at youthforclimate.live. And since then, the dates for next year's pre-COP and COP have been announced. The pre-COP will happen in Milan from September 30th to October 2nd, and Glasgow will host COP26 from November 1st to the 12th. And the landscape for youth activism on climate has changed dramatically in recent years. We saw this growing momentum through record-breaking protests in 2019, but this year's COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted much of what we know. Can you tell us about how your strategy for youth engagement is evolving, and maybe how this influences plans for youth in pre-COP and COP26 next year?
Sure, thank you, Ahmed. I think it's definitely important to realize that COVID-19 really shifted how young people were active in the climate space over the past years. Like you said, last year, I think we saw really huge number of young people from across the world who were either on the streets or they were, talking in meetings or attending conferences, ensuring that young people are present at where decisions are taken, ensuring that young people are pushing their governments to do more and more each day. And I think this is definitely, from what I have seen since the past 5 or 6 years that I have been active in the youth space, I think this is the most amount of young people that we've seen of late. And our demands have mainly been about inclusivity, whether it is in ensuring that young people are included in decision-making platforms, are included at the tables, our voices are heard, but also about inclusion of young women and girls, of young indigenous people, of inclusion of people with disabilities. So no matter what your gender is, no matter where you come from, no matter which part of the world you are from, we want to ensure that, everyone is included in the dialogue together and that everyone's voices are all heard in the same place. They're all mainstreamed and not sidelined. And I think our demands, regardless of whether the COVID pandemic hit us or not, I think our demands are still the same. So going into COP26 or going into pre-COP next year, our demands still remain the same, which shows us that, we really still have a lot of work to do because our demands are not changing and they're not decreasing. They're increasing day by day. But I think what COVID-19 has definitely shown us is that it has shown us that we're not prepared to deal with a massive crisis. It has shown us that the world really needs to step up its game, but it has also shown us that if we come together as a global community, we can work together and we can take the actions required to fight a crisis. And I think when it comes to youth activism, this also says something similar, that young people all across the world are coming together. We need to ensure that taking into this runway for COP26, and we've really never had this much of time from one COP to another to plan, and even as young people to strategize and plan and ensure that what our demands would be and what we would want for impacts to happen at COP. We've really never had so much of time. And I think this is definitely a great amount of time if we use it well to ensure that the planning of the COP, right from the logistics of it to how the COP is held or how the pre-COP is held, is inclusive in all forms as possible, is meaningful when it comes to young people's participation or participation of civil society, and also to ensure that as young people, as a global community, we ensure that we are really taking momentum, we're really taking charge already. All of our actions have moved online, and I think people are realizing that no matter where you're from, you don't necessarily need to meet in person to make decisions. And this has been great, and we're really utilizing that, and I hope we keep doing that in the next year until we reach COP.
You highlight two really, really important things here. First, I think, is this urgency of this moment we're in. It's a moment unlike any other, but also it's a moment where we've seen such amazing mobilization by so many different generations to try and address climate action and climate change. And so that's a really, really key thing to highlight. And I think the other thing too is this need to realize how inclusivity needs to be intersectional. It's not, two-dimensional. It has to be three-dimensional. We have to realize kind of the different intersections and the different meanings and representations of that word inclusive. So thank you so much, Heeta, for your thoughts and really, really insightful points.
Yeah, I think this is a really good time to now take a look at the national level and bring Rachele to the stage. Because last month, your government, the Italian government, unveiled their plans for stronger youth engagement in the pre-COP in Milan with a dedicated Youth for Climate event. So they revealed that pre-COP will offer a platform where global youth can engage in a dialogue with government negotiators ahead of Glasgow. So we want to know, how is this news received by youth climate networks in Italy, and how do you plan to use this opportunity in your work on climate change at the national level?
Thank you, Salina. Yes, I believe this news has been welcomed by organizations in Italy, especially because it's a sign of institutions opening up to the public, to youth especially, but in general also to civil society as a whole. As Ernest and Heeta already highlighted, the demand of youth to be heard in the climate discussion is quite clear. People want to speak up, want to be involved in the decision making, but we've seen in the poll earlier on that this is not always so easy, also because we don't know how to do it. So we believe these are in Italy, these news of the youth club, the pre-COP in general, has been welcome because it can be a very good bridge between youth, national institutions, and also to see how this connects to the international processes, which I believe is very, very crucial. And in particular, I think the added value of this event is that it's not an isolated event. And it's also one further step taken by Italy to try to involve and open up to youth and civil society organizations. You may know that Italy has been one of the countries that supported the inclusion of the principle of intergenerational equity in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. And also it has signed the Congress pledge to really commit to engaging youth when discussing climate adaptation, mitigation, and other actions. And it has also taken further steps into including sustainable development in school education. So these are all elements that make us wishful that this is going to be a systemic engagement. So an engagement that is not isolated and it's not a silo event, but it's an event that is planned as part of a wider engagement. So we welcome that. And we also hope that this will continue to be further operationalized. So we hope that Italy will continue to structure its way in which it engages youth. For example, it could take experiences from other countries with official youth delegates, and also to open up the discussion with youth, not only on climate-specific topics, but also on the recovery, because we know climate is not an isolated element, but it will be crucial to be discussed together with social and economic elements when planning or dealing with post-COVID. And you also asked me what we are planning to do as an organization. And as Italian Climate Network, we are, of course, preparing for this event, but we don't want to do this alone. We are working with on different levels. So on international level, we participate to Yango. We are part of the constituency, and we want to continue working in the Yango working groups to make sure that there is participation from youth, both at the formal Youth COP event, but also in general, that there can be connections with other important events, such as the Conference of Youth, and basically that these events can speak to each other somehow. And we also, on a national level, want to ensure that we can act and put together different organizations, youth organizations and civil society organizations, to make sure that we can create enough engagement and reinforce participation of youth and civil society, and take this really as an opportunity to frame national discussions on the climate topic and have this intersectional view that you also described, so taking into account several elements. And of course, as we mentioned before, we need youth and not only youth, civil society in general, to be prepared to be able to engage in these discussions. So we will continue our projects in schools, and also not only in schools, but in general events for the public, to make sure that they can be informed and there can be education with regards to the climate emergency and its possible solutions.
That's great to hear. I'm honestly, we're all wishing the best and looking forward to what you will plan next year. And I think one really powerful takeaway from what you've said is that youth engagement on climate also looks like youth engagement on recovery and on economics and social justice and other issues that are facing our society. So we want to thank our wonderful speakers for joining us. It's so important that we hear from activists at all different levels and to be in discussion together.
And if you have any questions for any of our speakers about their experience around meaningful youth engagement, please share them with us in the chat. We have a question and answer section coming up very soon.
Jayathma, we can't wait to hear your reflections on these comments. But before that, we'd like to hear from Italy's Minister of Environment, Minister Costa, who has a special announcement about youth participation at the pre-COP in Milan.
Se il tema del clima è diventato finalmente centrale nelle agende internazionali, lo si deve anche a voi giovani, che con la vostra mobilitazione, con la vostra protesta e soprattutto le vostre proposte avete contribuito a risvegliare l'opinione pubblica sul carattere di estrema emergenza della crisi climatica. Trovo positiva la carica di motivazione e di slancio ideale, anche di acuta critica, di cui siete portatori, perché alimenta e accelera la spinta verso il cambiamento trasformativo che oggi si impone nei nostri stili di vita, nei nostri modelli di produzione e consumo e nelle nostre economie. Il più ampio coinvolgimento delle giovani generazioni nei processi decisionali sulle politiche climatiche non è solo un dovere per noi decisori politici, in ossequio ai principi di inclusività e di giustizia intergenerazionale sanciti anche dall'Accordo di Parigi. È una necessità per ampliare gli orizzonti, abbracciando sensibilità e visioni di chi erediterà la terra sulla quale viviamo. Ed è un'opportunità per recepire stimoli e idee innovativi e per pensare finalmente fuori dagli schemi. Per questo ho voluto che l'Italia, nel partenariato con il Regno Unito per la COP26 del prossimo anno, organizzasse per la prima volta nella storia delle conferenze delle parti un evento dedicato ai giovani, in coincidenza con la pre-COP, dal 28 al 30 settembre 2021 a Milano. Ospiteremo 400 giovani con rispetto della parità di genere da tutti i paesi della Convenzione sul clima, per farli dialogare con negoziatori e ministri e consentire di incidere sul processo negoziale sul clima. Ci sarà una nazione in più alla pre-COP, ci sarà la nazione dei giovani, di voi. Credo profondamente nel protagonismo dei giovani. Ho aderito durante il Summit sul clima di New York un anno fa con numerosi colleghi di altri paesi all'impegno Kvon-Gesh, cioè la promessa solenne di coinvolgere i giovani nelle politiche ambientali. In Italia, con il Ministro dell'Istruzione, ho promosso l'inserimento dell'educazione alla sostenibilità e al clima nelle scuole italiane, in tutte le scuole di ogni ordine e grado. Sempre in Italia, stiamo costruendo un comitato consultivo dei giovani che fornisca pareri al Ministero nell'azione per il clima e per l'ambiente. L'immenso giacimento di energie positive e costruttive che voi rappresentate non può rimanere sotterraneo, deve emergere e dialogare per innalzare l'ambizione e vincere la sfida del cambiamento climatico. Insieme lo possiamo fare.
Minister Costa said it best, a nation of young people. Thank you again, Minister, for the detailed and thoughtful overview of Italy's plans to integrate youth participation into the pre-COP. I really especially appreciated the emphasis on intergenerational justice, which was also highlighted by Rachele a couple minutes ago in speaking about intergenerational equity as well. Such important dynamics to highlight. And now, before we jump into our Q&A session, we'd like to welcome back the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. Welcome back, Jayathma. We want to ask, what are your reflections on the discussion so far?
Yes, well, thank you. I had a great time listening to our three youth speakers, and really, I there's nothing more I can say than I agree with everything that was said by my colleagues. But I made a few notes, and I would like to maybe touch upon a few points that they mentioned and dig a little deeper into them. First of all, I wanted to reiterate the announcement that the Minister of Italy just made regarding the Youth COP that we will have in Italy next year with the participation of over 400 young people and really bringing together a community of youth to show the policymakers what real ambition could look like if young people were the ones who were calling the shots and if young people were the ones who are taking the decisions. So I'm really looking forward to next year. And I hope that this Youth for Climate series and with its engagement with the Italian Ministry for Climate and Environment, we will be able to bring all of these online conversations that we are having also as an integral part of the COP. So those of you who cannot be there in person can in this way contribute to those conversations. And in that light, I'm really excited to be partnering with the World Bank's Connect for Climate and the Italian Ministry for Climate and Environment in what I would call this 2-year journey towards the Youth COP. What was very clear in what Ernest, Heeta, and Rachele said is that there are so many things that are wrong, from the energy sector to the climate policies to implementation of climate agreements and the accountability when it comes to member states really implementing what they promised. But young people are not waiting for others to do something about it, right? And they are taking action. They are taking action in their own lives. They are changing their own lifestyles, and they are changing their communities. They are bringing solutions, and they are out there on the streets demanding our leaders to do the same. So what is very clear is that this generation of young people are not sitting there waiting for an invitation. They are really out there doing something about it and taking matters into their hand. And I think that leaves a lot of us very hopeful for the future, but we all know that hope is not enough. We need action, and we need action now, because this is an existential crisis for me, for you, for our generation, and for those who are coming after us. So it's very heartening to see all of us working with that urgency in the back of our minds, and really trying to push the policymakers to have that same urgency in their minds as well. And I really like this narrative that some of the youth climate organizations have tried to bring forth during the COVID pandemic. It's that the COVID crisis and this pandemic was an emergency. It was a humanitarian emergency, but the climate emergency will be so much bigger, and it is so much bigger. And that is why even though it doesn't look like it, we are actually dealing with two pandemics or two humanitarian situations at the same time. So that need and that urgency and that political commitment that we saw from majority of our leaders in addressing the COVID crisis, if we could see that in addressing the climate crisis, I think we will all be able to, sleep at night and at least be confident that, we are going to have a future, a livable planet to live in. And I don't think that's too much to ask. In terms of engagement of young people, I think all three of our speakers have spoken a lot about engagement at the policymaking level, and that's the important conversation topic today. But I also wanted to focus a little bit about local level engagement. And I think a lot of the decisions, policies that are made at the global level are very sort of, generic in nature, and they are more like, they are results of compromises, right? From the powerful countries and the developing countries and the developed countries. So a lot of the problems that we are facing today, I feel the answers should be local and should be homegrown. So involvement of young people in local solutions and local policies of utmost important. And that's why I want to reiterate what Akim Steiner said in the last episode about the engagement of young people in developing the next set of nationally determined contributions. And many governments are currently either finalizing or putting together their plans. And I really, really encourage all of you to proactively look at what your government's plan is, what they're doing. Reach out to the UNDP officers in your countries, because from the UN, it's them who are coordinating. Let us know if you like to be connected, because I think this is a huge opportunity, a very concrete opportunity that we have when it comes to actually pushing our governments to increase their ambition at the national level and determine a good decisive plan when it comes to how as a country they are going to contribute to achieve the Paris Agreement. Secondly, as we are coming out of the pandemic and really trying to see this silver lining in the dark clouds, many countries are also putting together their recovery plans, right? Many governments are looking at how the 2021 budget is going to look like, the stimulus packages that will go in to our economic rebuilding of our countries. And this I see is a golden opportunity again, where we can say, why don't we make this transition a sustainable one, a greener transition? And so many young people have lost their jobs, and why don't we create greener, dignified jobs for them? And that's what young people want, and this is an opportunity to create those jobs. And a few other points that I would like to reiterate again that was said by our colleagues is the importance of climate education. And I think after the pandemic, there's a lot of discussions about public health education and how awareness should be made in schools and in universities about for young people about public health. And I think that same urgency needs to go into including climate education in our curriculums as well. Lastly, an important comment was made on civic engagement, and I think it's extremely important that we look at how young people participate in political processes as well when it comes to decision making. And lastly, on a lot of the survey results said that young people didn't know who to engage and how to engage and when to engage. And I think we shouldn't put the responsibility on young people to find that information themselves. I think this information should be easily and democratically available and accessible to all people by government. Sorry, I spoke a lot, but I'll stop from there.
Thank you so much. You've touched on so many incredible points that really are across the conversation we're having, right? So the sense of urgency, where we are, where we want to go, and then also just the importance of action. You know, we oftentimes get caught up in just the conversation aspect of things, but as the minister mentioned, there is an event in the calendar, and it's completely youth-centered and youth-focused, and so finding different ways again to work together and really examine all of those intersections across education, across civic engagement, are really, really important as we collectively move forward and figure out how to recover, but also how to build back better.
Yeah, and I think at this point, we really want to bring all our speakers back to talk about something. We always say the words youth engagement, and we use the word meaningful. But what does meaningful youth engagement mean? So this is something I'd love for the audience to think about too. And to the speakers, as each of you advocate for youth engagement in both your personal and professional capacity, we'd like you to share what the word meaningful means to you when it comes to youth participation. And if you have any effective examples that you've seen at local, national, international levels, we'd love to hear from them. So perhaps, Jayathma, could you kick us off with this?
Yeah, I think some of those principles were mentioned by principles for meaningful engagement was mentioned by our speakers earlier. But I have this list that I compiled when I was working on the youth strategy for the UN to kind of direct the UN and give that guidance to the UN as to what meaningful youth engagement should be. And I'll try to quickly go through some of those indicators. And the first thing is about being institutionally mandated. And I think Rachele mentioned this earlier. It's very easy to have young people at a side event or in some concert or have young people as a decorative item. But if there is a mandate by a resolution or by an institution to meaningfully engage young people for their expertise, then it's very difficult to use young people as a decoration, and it gives credibility to their voices and the expertise they bring. So I think it's extremely important not to just limit young people into side events and consultations, but have them in the actual decision making. Secondly, it should be a safe space. Unfortunately, we have seen youth engagement happen in spaces that are not very safe, but youth engagement to be meaningful, it should be a safe space where their rights are respected, that they are safe from all sort of abuse online and offline. We've seen, unfortunately, cases of abuse of power, sexual harassment and abuse, even in these spaces where it's supposed to be safe for young people. And this should be a must, that it is a safe space for young people. And funding and allocating budgets for youth engagement is another important point. And you asked about examples, Salina, and there are so many examples in my time here at the UN where I get a call like 2 days before an event, and can you find a young person to speak at this event in 2 days? And how can you have a transparent representative process of selecting a youth representative and then get them a visa and get them on a plane to come to New York to speak at the UN in 2 days, right? And this makes that these opportunities always go to young people who can afford it, or young people who are living in New York or already working at the UN. And that really, it's very unfair. And I think if institutions are serious about youth engagement, we need to have those processes in place where it's properly funded, it's properly planned, and it's done in a transparent and dignified manner. Lastly, accountability is important. I think, we spend a lot of time consulting young people, but we never go back to them and give them feedback about what happened to those consultations, right? We don't tell them if their ideas were taken. We don't tell them why their ideas were taken or not taken, and we don't close that loop often. And a lot of the times in projects, you don't see institutions going back to the communities after the project to give that feedback and get that feedback and, wrap it up in that proper way. So oftentimes young people feel used, and they are being used, and that creates also a fatigue among young people not to trust institutions and engage with institutions again. So these are some of the things that I've seen in my work, but I'm sure my colleagues will have a lot more to add.
Thank you so much. That's really powerful. We don't have a lot of time, so I'd love to just hand over to Rachele. What are your thoughts? What do you want to add to this?
Thank you. So I guess meaningful engagement is like a recipe, so you need a few ingredients to make it work, right? And I wanted just to add to what Jayathma already said. So I think I would like to build on two main elements. One is a pillar made of open access to information. So we've seen before, we don't know sometimes who to address, and we don't have all the information we need to actively participate. And in order to actively participate, we also need to have the tools, therefore the knowledge and the education to do that. And I believe this is the first pillar. And the second pillar would be the one about inclusiveness. It was mentioned, you need funds, you need ways to ensure that everybody feels safe to participate and has a voice, and not just pick on the people that are available to you, and make sure that the participation is meaningful, and it has to be systematic, as I mentioned earlier. And just an example for meaningful engagement, I really think it was for the Paris Agreement, when Yango came together and with people and youth across the world advocated for the inclusion of the principle of intergenerational equity. I mean, this really required a lot of preparation. It required inclusiveness to make sure that this was relevant for youth all around the world and not just some of them. And also we were able to build the momentum necessary to engage policymakers at the right time. And gladly we managed, and this opened up future doors for us, like these kind of events now.
Thanks so much. Heeta, what would you like to add?
I think Jayathma and Rachele covered a lot of very important points. And I think the only thing that I'd want to add here is, ensure that young people are at the decision-making tables. You cannot have youth inclusion if you're keeping them in the sidelines. So have young people in your national delegations, have young people as part of when you're either making, for example, NDCs in your country or local level policy making, even whether it is city level policy making. Ensure that you ask young people what they think and then take into consideration their thoughts, not just ask them and forget about it. So I think it's very important to realize that young people aren't a prop to make your event look pretty, or to make it, to say that, here we had young people as part of our panel or whatever that is. But I think we need to realize that young people have ideas and have solutions that need to be credited, and give them the spot to do so.
Thank you so much. It's really great to see how this is building. And last but not least, Ernest, what would you like to add?
Sure, my answer is just D, all of the above. I completely agree with everything that was said beforehand. No, honestly, there's a seriously comprehensive list of things that we need to be taking into account when we think about meaningful engagement. And Jayathma, I wrote, you can't read because my writing is horrendous, but in my notes I wrote about closing the feedback loop when we engage youth, because there is nothing worse than when you give your time and energy towards a space or an initiative and nothing comes of it, because then it's an extremely extractive process. The second thing is around ensuring that it's deliberate. So if you want it to be meaningful, you can't just be doing something for the photo opportunity or for the big fancy event, or for having a young person in a room where the mean age is 55, because then you're just doing it for the fun of it, and you're not doing it for actual meaningful engagement that's deliberate and trying to drive change. And the third one that I want to talk about is something that my mother told me when I first started doing youth engagement. She said, Ernest, what you need to remember is that youth cannot continue to be doing all the heavy lifting when it comes to youth engagement, because this is a multifaceted and a multi-pronged approach that needs to be put in place. If youth are doing the heavy lifting, it means that politicians, it means that world leaders, it means that people who have allowed the system that doesn't work to continue to perpetuate are getting off scot-free. So we need to hold them to account. So if you want meaningful engagement, it means that you have not just youth at these tables, but you have people who have been in the space who really have a serious amount of responsibility that they need to own up to for not including youth well enough and not meaningfully enough. I think about an example that has worked really well. Last year, UNDP in the Pacific was applying for ANCP funding. Sorry, not ANCP, ACP funding. And they made the conscious decision to, when they were planning the proposal to apply for funding, to bring in youth into the process, to teach youth how to apply for funding, how to write the millions of documents that are required to ensure that we can secure funding, but also to provide the support to ensure that we meet all the requirements to ensure that we can receive that funding. And that level of capacity development accompanied by actual inclusive dialogue is exactly what we need. And I think what's really important is UNDP then came back to us and said, unfortunately, this time around, we didn't get the funding. And that's a hard conversation to have with people who you took time off of. But the fact that they had that conversation and closed that feedback loop is a testament to the idea that we're trying to ensure that we're meaningful. So to be meaningful, we need to be deliberate, we need to be multifaceted, and we need to ensure that we are being inclusive and closing that feedback loop.
Thank you so much. This has been so incredible. I think sometimes as a young person, there's this burden on you where people will come and say, okay, well, what do you want? What do you mean? What is meaningful youth engagement? And, you know, if this is your first couple months in the game, this is why we need to have this conversation as a community, to be able to learn from each other and to hear the various experiences and the examples. I'm really grateful for all of you for sharing this, because I think it offers us all a roadmap for what we demand for in the future and what we require even of ourselves as leaders.
Absolutely. And this is the exact point of this series, you know, is to have these conversations and to be able to engage and build from one another. And so this is, again, something that has always been a goal of this. And so we're really happy that it's at the forefront and really happy to see all these conversations come up. And so now we'd like to kickstart our thinking about next steps, how we can transform our dialogue on meaningful engagement into concrete actions. In our Instagram live session with the UN Youth Envoy last week, I spoke to 3 young leaders. And one thing that came up constantly is storytelling, and how as young people we can leverage different storytelling mediums like filmmaking or podcasting to inspire and mobilize towards climate action. But this is just one option. And we'd love to ask you, the audience, to share your thoughts. If you close your Menti poll, the QR code is back up on the screen, or you can click on the link in the chat. And when you get to the screen, you'll see this question. What would help open the door for you to meaningfully engage with decision makers? And we have several options here. The creation of national or local youth climate councils, youth consultations on climate-related decisions and policies, expanded climate change education in schools, support in leveraging different storytelling media, access to funding for youth-led projects, young people as elected officials, or something else. You can tell us in the chat box. Seems like the third option is the most popular for now, but the first is also climbing up. Expanded climate change education in schools. Again, this is one of the options that really has an impact that reflects on all of the other options, right? Because the more we know about the issue, the more we understand our place within it and our place to act within it. And so really, it's interesting to see that that's the topic that is most popular at the moment. So again, understanding that, you know, every single option here can't stand necessarily on its own, but is intersectional with all of the other ones present. And so let's keep this in mind. And again, we want to keep the conversation going. Every part of this series, every part of this specific episode builds on the one before it, and we want it to be a continuing conversation. And so to follow up, we want to ask a final question, which will be open for the remainder of the session. And that question is, in 1 to 2 words, what does meaningful youth engagement on climate action look like to you? And again, this is open-ended. You can check out the Connect for Climate social media after the session, where we'll reveal all of your answers. And so without further ado, Salina, welcome back. Shall we kick off the Q&A session?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a great time. We have some questions from the audience, and we don't have a lot of time. So I'm really sorry if we don't get to them all. So if we don't get to your question, please do ask our speakers on social media. You can see their handles in the chat, and they'll be there to kind of answer it afterwards. So the first question we would like to ask, Heeta, maybe you can take this one. This is from Joanna. She asks, what is more important to focus on for individuals what is more important to focus on for individuals to contact decision makers, or for us kind of trying to reduce our own carbon footprint?
I think both. There is no one solution over here. We definitely need to do both. We have to contact our decision makers. We have to ensure that government policies are being taken. But at the same time, I don't think we can just do one thing and have a huge carbon footprint ourselves. So I think we need to be mindful of what we're doing as we live our lives. But that's not enough. All of us could go carbon neutral or carbon negative, but it's not going to be enough if we only take individual action. So we definitely have to push corporations, and we definitely have to push our governments to do more as well. So both.
Yeah, I see clapping. Does anyone else want to add to that? If not, we have another question from a few different people. One is from Sylvia, also from, I think, Sora, 17 years old. And they're really around how can this generation kind of make a change. So Zora says, I have a national organization made up by people my age. What advice would you give me to make change? And then Sylvia asks, I'm a young student. What are the actions I can start doing to make a change? Where do we start? Ernest, perhaps you can kick us off with this one. What advice do you have for them both?
So I think there are so many pieces of advice that need to be given, and if you need any further explanation, feel free to reach out to me. But I think one thing that we always need to be doing is being in communication with each other. We need to recognize that it's extremely important that we're adding value to each other's work, but also that we're working smarter. So the only way to work smarter is if we talk to each other, we understand what each other is doing, and we find ways in which we can enhance each other's work. The only way that we're going to win this fight is if we do it together. And there's no room for having this space as being a competition between organizations or individuals, because as youth, we have one common goal, and that's to ensure that the future we leave behind is better than the future that we were given. So communicate with each other and work together.
Powerful. Rachele, do you want to add to that? What advice do you have?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would like to give a very practical advice, or at least what worked for me in the past. And for me, joining associations and being engaged with colleagues at school, but then also going beyond that, has been really the key to, first of all, get information. I learned so much from my peers, and it has been a very enriching experience, both on a professional and personal level. And then via associations, you really can have a powerful voice and have your voice replicated. And it also helps you shape your own idea, because you might have a very limited view of the situation. And by talking to other people, you can really build up your own view on what you think should be done. And you can already start collaborating on it.
Yeah, it's perfect. And lastly, Jayathma, you're the envoy on youth. So what advice do you have in terms of where to start?
Yeah, I mean, you are here because you have already started, right? And because you care and you're committed, and whatever you're doing it's in your personal capacity. If you're trying to reduce your own carbon footprint, or you're with your local organization, with your peers, continue to do what you do, and that's really what's going to make a difference. And if I could add just one thing, if you are a young person who have your own youth organization, who has peers joining you and doing work in your community, you are already privileged, right? Because there are so many young people around the world who do not have that privilege. They live in countries where freedom of association is not possible. They live in countries where speaking up against government policy is illegal, and they can face persecution. So if you can build bridges and support young people like that struggling in other parts of the world, I have seen youth climate organizations in different countries speaking up for their sister organizations in other countries and providing their social media platforms and writing opinion pieces on behalf of their friends, and really show that solidarity across borders to help protect young climate activists, but at the same time provide them a platform to have their voices heard when they can't do that in their own right. So if I could add one thing, I would always add that to say, please find ways where you can uphold and support other youth climate organizations and platforms as well.
Thank you. That's so powerful, this aspect of acknowledging privilege. We are running out of time, unfortunately, so we would like to ask you guys a hard question. If you had to sum up this conversation in just one word, what would it be? Perhaps, Ernest, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. The word that I would use to describe this conversation is ongoing, because the conversation cannot end here.
Love it. Heeta?
I think I would call this meaningful.
I love it. Rachele?
I would go with reinvigorating, because it's good to know that we are not alone.
No, we're not. And lastly, Jayathma.
Yeah, I wanted to say reassuring, because, you know, when you work inside a huge institution and you're trying to push for these values, sometimes it feels very lonely, as if you're the only one fighting for this. But it's so reassuring to hear from so many like-minded young people, and kind of reassures that we are on the right path. So
thank you so much. This is an incredible conversation. And the huge takeaway is we really are not alone. There's so much experience. There's a wealth of knowledge. When we did that poll in the beginning, people said, oh, you know, I don't have enough knowledge yet. You definitely do. And if you don't, the community around you of young activists have it. So definitely reach out, build bridges. And then if you don't know who to contact, Jayathma's shown us that look at your country's NDC's plans, get in touch with the UNDP officers in your country. That's the UN Development Program. And that's a great starting point for you to start engaging with decision makers in your country. So thank you so much, everyone, for a lovely conversation. Ahmed, over to you.
And Ernest said it best. This is ongoing, and we couldn't agree more. And so ongoing is just one of the words we would use to sum this up, but we'd love to hear from you about how you would sum it up. And today we're excited to launch the SumItUp competition, where one winner will be selected to participate in the Youth for Climate Driving Ambition event in Milan next year. All you need to do is share your creative sum-ups with us. There will be 3 phases to the competition, each focusing on 3 out of 9 episodes. Today marks the beginning of the submissions for the first phase, where we invite you to create your own visual summary of episodes 1 to 3 between now and episode 4. And you can find out more by clicking the link in the chat.
So episode 4 is on September 25th, so you have 4 weeks to get it together. We can't wait to see what you've come up with and to check back in with you all again next month. You can register now for the episode at youthforclimate.live. And we also want to share a massive thank you to the Italian Ministry for Environment, Land and Sea, Connect for Climate, the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth for hosting us today. Please do follow them on social to stay updated on all upcoming episodes. You can see their handles up on the screen now.
We hope that you found this session inspiring and promising. And again, it will be ongoing, and we would love to hear more of your thoughts. So let's continue the conversation online. And so, but lastly, please turn on your video to say goodbye, and we hope to see you next month.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.